Hi, everybody. Brad Truax here from Eastman's Woodlands and Wildlife Committee. And today we're going to talk about crows and ravens. These are a couple of very misunderstood birds. They're often reviled because they're noisy and because they've been known to actually eat the eggs and hatchlings of some songbirds. But there's a lot to learn about crows and ravens. Crows and ravens are members of the corvid family. And other corvids include magpies, blue jays, and several other jays, nutcrackers, and a few other species. And corvids are actually considered the most intelligent birds. More on that later on. So, what was that blackbird? Was it a raven or was it a crow? Well, the most obvious difference is that the raven is much bigger. So, here you see a raven on the right, crow on the left, and there's no question the raven is the much bigger bird. Crows are only about two-thirds the size of a raven, but how often would you get to see a crow and a raven side by side like they are in this picture? So we really need to look at other features in order to be able to distinguish them. So again, the ravens are bigger. They have thicker, curvier beaks. Ravens often travel in pairs or solo, whereas crows tend to be seen in larger groups. And when they're flying, ravens tend to soar, whereas crows tend to flap their wings while they're flying. And as it flies, the crow's tail feathers are basically the same length. So when the crow spreads its tail, it opens like a fan. On the other hand, ravens have longer middle feathers in their tails. So when they are flying, their tail appears to be more wedge shaped or even diamond shaped when it's open. And crows caw and purr, whereas ravens have a deeper croak and a scream. Crows tend to walk on the ground, whereas ravens tend to strut with two-footed hops. So again, here's a crow on the left, a raven on the right. The raven obviously has a thicker, more curved beak. The raven often has this roughed feathers in its throat. That's called a hackle, whereas the feathers on the crow are very smooth on the throat. Okay, the ravens croak, whereas the crows caw. So once again, the crows tend to caw, whereas the ravens tend to croak. Also, the tail pattern can help us differentiate ravens from crows. I mentioned before that the crows tend to have a straight-edged tail, so it looks like this, whereas the ravens tend to have a more either diamond-shaped or some people call this a wedge-shaped tail. I don't particularly like those two terms, fan-shaped and wedge-shaped, because they're easily confused. But when they're fanned out, a raven's center tail feathers are noticeably longer than the outer ones. So right here, you can see that the center feathers are much longer than the ones that are out to the sides. So again, here we have in this picture, we have a top left. This is a raven flying. Once again, you can see that the tail the center tail feathers are much longer. So again, some people have called this a wedge shape, whereas over here, the crow flying, the tail feathers tend to be more of a fan shape. And once again, here, if you look at the beak on the raven tends to be much thicker and more curved. When they're on the ground, crows usually walk, whereas the ravens tend to walk and hop. The video shows a raven doing the so-called two-step hop. Okay, and again, this is another one that's kind of summarizing the difference. Again, the ravens have these throat feathers. Ravens here are on the left, crows over here on the right. So again, these rough feathers on the throat of the raven compared to smooth feathers on the crow. Once again, in terms of the tail of the raven tends to be more wedge-shaped compared to the fan-shaped tail of the crow. Again, crows tend to caw, whereas ravens tend to croak. And the ravens tend to flap their wings. I'm sorry, the crows tend to flap their wings when they're flying, whereas the ravens actually are quite acrobatic. They tend to soar when they're flying, and they'll do rolls and somersaults. They'll even fly upside down. Here's one that's actually flying upside down. So again, here's a mnemonic that I've tried. For the crow, it's CCFF. C stands for caw, that's the sound they make. C is for crowd because they're usually seen in a crowd of more than one. F means they flap their wings when they're flying, and F is for fanning their tail when they're flying. On the other hand, Raven, I use the acronym SHOWS. S is for soar, and that's because, again, usually they're soaring and very acrobatic, and they're not doing a lot of wing flapping when they're flying. HO is for hopping. Remember, I showed you that two-footed hop they tend to do. W is for a wedge-shaped tail. That's when they're flying. And S is for solo, because again, they tend to either be seen as solo or in pairs. Okay, a little bit about crows. Crows are big birds, not quite as big as a raven, but they do measure 17 to 21 inches in length. And both the males and females are all black. They have very stout beaks that are straight. That's compared to the curved beaks of the raven. And they tend to have that fan-shaped tail. Where do crows live? They live almost anywhere. They're very adaptable. They'll live in woodlands, farmlands, fields, river groves, shores, even in towns. More and more they've been seen in suburbs and around towns. And they usually prefer semi-open habitats like farmland or open fields or clearings in the woods. And again, the caw of the crow is one of the most frequently heard calls of almost any bird in any location. But they actually have multiple vocalizations that communicate different things. Okay, in terms of flying, whereas ravens need a little running takeoff to become airborne, crows can lift off into the air from almost any spot. And the crows are usually flapping their wings when they're flying, and that's compared to the ravens, which are much more likely to soar. So here's the crows flying, they're flapping their wings. And once again, ravens, on the other hand, tend to soar without much wing flapping. Crow tracks, crows typically have three toes pointing forward and one backward, and that's very common for a whole host of birds. So it's a pattern that is shared by many birds, and probably size is probably the most important way to distinguish crow tracks from the tracks of other birds. So here's some crow tracks in the sand up here, and here's some in the snow. My bet is that this was not a single crow, it was probably multiple crows that were walking in the snow. Those track patterns sometimes tell a story. So here's some crow tracks in freshly fallen snow, and this crow was likely hunting. So he's walking over here, and some sort of skirmish took place here. The crow probably caught some small prey, perhaps a very small mouse. So what do crows eat? Well, crows are not picky eaters. They'll eat almost anything. You've, of course, seen them eating roadkill or carrion, but they're actually not very good at breaking open the skin of roadkill. So they actually need other animals to start the job or wait for that roadkill to decompose before they start eating it. But they'll also eat seeds, nuts, insects, and worms. They may even eat small frogs or fish. And unfortunately, they also find bird nests and may eat the eggs or nestlings of some songbirds. That's one of the things that gives them a bad reputation. They'll also eat garbage and food scraps, and sometimes they'll cache their food for later consumption. And they may also steal food from other birds and animals. So crows are monogamous. They usually remain with one mate for an entire lifetime. They're usually sexually mature by about age 2, but they often wait several years before they pair up with a mate. And the male will usually stand by guarding the nest once the eggs have been laid. Crows are very family oriented, and the young may actually remain with their parents for several years. In fact, the extended family may be up to 15 or more crows, actually spanning several generations. So, crows are very social birds. Unlike ravens, crows are rarely seen alone. They're usually in groups, they're very family oriented, and they may also roost and forage in very large numbers. And in winter, hundreds or even thousands of crows may roost together. And they'll often communicate the presence of potential predators, and they'll often mob those predators. Uh, at several occasions, I've actually heard multiple crows start cawing loudly. And if I look around, I'll see why they were doing that. It was probably because there was a bobcat or a black bear nearby. Very interesting. So again, in winter, hundreds or even thousands of crows may roost together. This picture up top was taken in Lebanon, New Hampshire in January of 2025. And you can see hundreds, perhaps even thousands of crows flying in the sky. And listen to the crows that are calling in this.
Simparica trio protects against 3 categories of parasites.
Sorry for the
This drug class has been associated with neurologic side effects, including seizures. Use with caution in dogs with or without a history of these disorders. Don't just protect, triple protect.
So that's a pretty impressive group of crows there. Crows often roost together. You've often seen them roosting on power lines. This is a very familiar sight. Do the crows have any predators? Well, they really don't have many predators, mainly because they're so smart and because they use that mobbing behavior to chase predators away. Any predators that they have would likely be large raptors like great horned owls, hawks, or eagles. And the nestlings in the eggs could be preyed upon by raccoons, snakes, squirrels, or even other birds. And humans are probably their main predator, along with domestic cats, foxes, and coyotes, which might be targeting the fledglings. And both crows and ravens are particularly susceptible to West Nile virus. So, how about ravens? Ravens are obviously bigger than crows. They average about 25 inches and can weigh up to a pound and a half. Their wingspan can be about 4 feet, pretty impressive. And like crows, they're all black. They have massive curved bills with long bristles at the base. And they have those throat feathers that are shaggy, often called haggles or often referred to as a cravat. And these can be puffed up. The tail is wedge shaped when they're in flight, and they tend to be solo or in pairs. And that's in comparison to the crows, which tend to be grouped together in larger flocks. So, where do ravens live? Well, again, they can live almost anywhere. They're very adaptable. They can live in forests and mountain areas, deserts, coastal areas, even in the tundra, and even in human modified landscapes like farms and landfills. But they do prefer open areas for foraging and for nesting, and they usually stay in one area year round. They tend not to migrate. So, do they have any predators? Well, once again, they don't have many predators, mainly because they're big and they're very aggressive. And any predators, again, would be large raptors like bald eagles, golden eagles, great horned owls, and some hawks. And those raptors would mostly target the eggs, chicks, or fledglings rather than the adult ravens. And occasionally, coyotes or martens or lynx might prey upon them. They may also mob the predators, but probably not as often as the crows do. And that's simply because you often have only a single raven or pair of ravens, as opposed to the crows, which have maybe hundreds of crows nearby. So the crows are actually much more able to mob any potential predators. On the other hand, sometimes the ravens or even the crows will call a potential predator to a carcass or roadkill. And that's because, like the crows, they have a hard time penetrating the skin layers. So they often need another animal to actually open up the carcasses before they're able to feed upon them. And as before, both ravens and crows are particularly susceptible to West Nile virus. So again, ravens tend to soar when they're flying, and they're actually quite acrobatic in flight. They can dive, they can do rolls, they can do somersaults, they can even fly upside down. So what do ravens eat? Well, they're very skilled scavengers and hunters. They eat a vast range of foods, including carcasses, garbage, insects, and fruit. You've often seen them feeding on roadkill. And they may prey upon small mammals and birds, some amphibians, and maybe even some small reptiles. And they're well known for working in pairs to steal food from other predators or to raid nests. And yes, they may raid and eat the eggs or hatchlings of songbirds. Once again, that's one of the things that gives them a bad rap. Uh, Similar to the crows, they are monogamous and they'll remain with one mate for a lifetime. They'll serenade each other with gentle coos for comfort. And like crows, they may also preen each other's feathers as a way to kind of strengthen the bond between the pair. They usually breed between February and May. Usually there's 3 to 7 eggs that are greenish blue and spotted. And their nests are made with sticks and they may be on cliffs or in trees. And the female will incubate the eggs for 20 to 25 days while the male is standing by and providing some food for the female. And both parents will feed the young hatchlings. Those young will remain in the nest for 5 to 7 weeks before they take their first flight. And they may stay with their parents for an extended period, or they may simply form flocks with other juveniles. And they'll usually begin breeding on their own once they're about 3 to 4 years old. So, how long do crows and ravens live? Well, ravens tend to live longer. They'll average 10 to 15 years in the wild, whereas crows live on average 7 to 8 years in the wild. But both ravens and crows can actually live much longer. Those averages are actually probably brought down by some young birds not surviving. So, what good are ravens and crows? Well, their main value is their scavenging. That helps prevent spread of disease. They're very effective cleanup crews when there's roadkill. And they'll also eat some insects that could harm agriculture. In fact, it's said that a single crow family can consume 40,000 insects, including grubs and caterpillars, etc., in a single nesting season. That's a pretty impressive number. They'll also disperse seeds. Remember, I said that they often fly off with seeds and will tend to cache them, and some of those will eventually germinate into trees or other vegetation. And they can also alert us to the presence of other wildlife. Remember, I mentioned before, on several occasions, I've heard the crows start to make an awful lot of noise. And I've looked around and seen either a bobcat or a black bear. And they're also an early warning system because the crows and the ravens are very susceptible to West Nile virus. If you find a dead crow or a dead raven, that can alert public health officials to the presence of the West Nile virus. Corvids are very smart. Members of the corvid family are considered to be extremely intelligent, and they have a brain to body mass ratio that's almost as high as humans. And in fact, it's as high as in some primates. Several of the subspecies have been seen using tools of various sources. And other examples are recognizing human faces, doing some problem solving. And some are actually said to have the cognitive abilities comparable to that of a 7-year-old child. So they're extremely smart birds. So how do those? I've often asked this question: how do those crows avoid my car? So again, we often see them in the middle of the road feeding on roadkill, yet they never seem to get hit by moving cars. That's different. Other birds may get hit by cars, and it's probably because they're so extremely intelligent. They tend to understand traffic patterns and they can judge the speed of oncoming vehicles. So that's probably why they never get hit. Uh, Usually, if you watch, they only fly a few feet to the side of the road rather than flying away. And then once the car is passed, they actually come back and finish off the roadkill. So here's a fun fact. Groups of animals are often given unique names. Many mammals come together in herds. Whales have pods. Many birds flock together. A group of geese is a gaggle. A group of owls is a parliament. Okay, so what do you call a group of crows? The answer, it's a murder. Now, I have no idea where that term originated and was unable to find out where it originated. So that's a little bit about crows and ravens. Hope that you will have a little better appreciation for them.